Well, welcome everybody tonight. Come on in, join the campfire. Come find you a nice place to sit and get you something to drink. A couple of things being passed around. There's some coffee over there on the edge of the fire. Build up that fire a little bit more before we get started and we'll start telling stories. It's a lot colder now. We got snow on the ground here and it's kind of spitting rain and snow alternating. Yeah, it's cold, which is a really good time to sit around the fire and tell stories. You know, I've been telling you that story of the Seventh Man, book 3 of the Untamed, and by Max Brand. Well, we're still in a really good spot. He's being chased by a posse, and darn if it's not exciting, so let's just carry right into that chapter 33, the jump. Well, he brought Satan back to a hand canter, and so he pulled around the next curve of the gulch and saw the trap squarely in front. He came to a full halt, for he saw a tall, strong barbed wire fence stretching across the stream bed, and beyond that fence were a litter of chicken coops and iron bands with broken barrels and 1,000 other of those things which brands the typical western farmyard. Above the top of the bank to his left, he caught a glimpse of the sharp roof of the house. He looked back, but it was far too late to turn, ride down the ravine to a place where the bank could be scaled and cut across country once more. The posse came like a whirlwind, yelling, shooting as if they'd hoped to attract attention. And attention they certainly won, for now Dan saw a tall, middle-aged feller, his long beard blowing over one shoulder as he ran, come down into the farmyard with a double-barreled shotgun in his hands. He was a type of those who do not know what it is to miss their target, probably because ammunition comes so high, and with a double load of buckshot, it was literally death to come within his range. Dan knew that a great many chances may be taken against a revolver, and even a rifle can be tricked, but it is suicide to flirt with a shotgun in the hands of one used to bring down doves as they sloped out of the air toward the waterhole. The farmer stood with his broad-brimmed straw hat pushed far back on his head, looking up and down the ravine, a perfect target, and Barry's hand slipped automatically over his rifle. His fingers refused to close upon it. "I can't do it, Satan," he whispered. "We got to take our chances of getting by, that's all. He couldn't have no hand with Gray Molly." Narrow chances indeed, by this time, for the brief pause had brought the posse fairly upon his heels. The farmer saw the fugitive and brought his shotgun to the ready. And Black Bart, in an agony of impatience, raced around and around the master. A wild cheer rose from the posse and came echoing about him. Why, they had sighted their quarry. From Rickett to Morgan Hills, from Morgan Hills to St. Vincent, from St. Vincent to Wago and far beyond. But this was the end of a historic run. "Do you see?" whispered Barry, leaning close to Satan's ears. "Lad, do you see what we got to do?" The black stood with his head very high, quivering through his whole body while he eyed the fence. It was murderously high, and all things were against him. The long run, the rise of the ground going towards the fence, and the gravel from which he must take off for the jump. "You can do it," said the master. "You got to do it. Go for it, boy. We win or we lose together." He swayed forward and Satan leaped ahead at full speed, gathering impetus, scattering the gravel on either side. The farmer on the inside of the fence raised his shotgun leisurely to his shoulder and took a careful aim. He knew what it all meant. He had heard of the outlaw Barry, with his black horse and his wolf dog. Well, everyone in the desert had, for that matter. And even had he been ignorant, the shouting of the posse, which now raced down the canyon in full view, would have told him all that he needed to know. How many things went through his mind while he squinted down that gleaming barrel. He thought of the long labor on the farm and the mortgage which still ate the life of his produce every year. The thought of the narrow-bowed shoulders of his wife. He thought of the meager faces of his children. And he thought first and last of $10,000 reward. No wonder the hand which supported the barrels was steady as an iron prop. He was shooting for his life and the happiness of 5 souls. He would save his fire till he literally saw the white of the enemy's eyes, until the outlaw reached the fence. No horse on the mountain desert could top the highest strands of that wire, as he very well knew, and in his youth back in Kentucky he had ridden hunters. That fence came exactly to the top of his head. The top of his head was 6 feet and 2 inches from the ground. To make assurance doubly sure, he dropped upon one knee and made that shotgun an unstirring part and portion of himself. Nobly the black came on, his ears pricking as he judged the great task, and his head carried just a little high and back, as any good jumper knows his head must be carried. The practiced eye of the farmer watched that outlaw gather his horse under him. Well he knew the meaning of that shortening grip on the reins to give that horse that last little lift that might mean success or failure in the jump. Well he knew that rise in the stirrups, that leaning forward, and his heart rose in unison and went back to the blue grass of Kentucky glittering in the sun. Before them went the wolf dog, skimming low, reached the fence and shot over it in a graceful high-arched curve. Then the shout of the rider, "Up, up!" and the stallion reared and leaped. He seemed to graze it coming up, so close was his takeoff. He seemed to be pawing his way over with his forefeet. And then with both legs doubled close, hugging his body, he shot straight across and left the highest strand of the wire quivering and humming. The farmer hurled his best shotgun a dozen yards away and threw up his hat. "Go it, lad! God bless ye and good luck!" The hand of the rider lifted in mute acknowledgment as he shot past. The farmer caught a glimpse of a delicately handsome face that smiled down at him. "The left gate! The left gate!" he shouted through his cupped hands. And as the fugitive rushed through the upper gate, he turned to face the posse which was already pulling up to the fence and drawing their wire cutters. As Barry shot out onto the higher ground on the other side of the farmhouse, he could see them severing the wires, and the interruption of the chase would only be a matter of seconds. But seconds counted triply now, and the halt and the time they would spend getting up impetus all told in favor of the fugitive. 35 miles, or thereabouts, since they left Rickett that morning, and still the black ran smoothly, with a lilt to its gallop. Dan Barry lifted his head, and his whistling soared and pulsed and filled the air. It made Bart come back to him. It made Satan toss his head and glance at the master from the corner of his bright eye. For this was an assurance that the battle was over and the rest not far away. On they drove, straight as a bird flies for Caswell City, and Black Bart, ranging ahead among the hills, was picking the way once more. If the stallion were tired, he gave no sign of it. The sweep of his stride brushed him past rocks and shrubs, and he literally flowed uphill and down, far different from the horses which scampered in his rear. For they pounded the earth with their efforts, grunting under the weight of their 50-pound saddles and heavy riders. Another handicap checked them. For while Satan ran on alone, freely, the bunched pursuers kept a continual friction back and forth. The leaders reined in to keep back with the mass of the posse, and those in the rear, by dint of hard spurring, would rush up to the front in turn until some spirited nag challenged for the lead, so that there was a steady interplay among the 15. Their gait, at the best, could not be more than the pace of the slowest member, but even that pace was diminished by the difficulties of group riding. Yet Mark Retherton refused to allow his men to scatter and stretch out. He kept them in hand steadily, a bunched unit ready to strike together, for he had seen the dead body of Pete Glass, and he kept in mind a picture of what might happen if this fellow should whirl and pick off the posse man by man. Better to prolong the run, for in the end no single horse could stand up against so many relays. Yet it was maddening to watch that stallion float over hill and dale with that same unbroken stride. Once and again he sent the fresh horses from Wago after the fugitive in a sprinting burst. But each time that black drifted further away. And mile after mile Mark Retherton pulled his field glasses to his eyes and strained his vision to make out some sign of labor in the gait of Satan. There was no change. His head was still high, the rhythm of his lope unfaltering. But here the Wago Mountains, not more than ragged hills to be sure, cut across the path of the outlaw, and in those hills, unless that message which waited for him at Wago had been false, should be the men of Caswell City, 20 or more, besides 15 fresh horses for his posse. 20 of men, at least. Caswell could send out, and from the heights they could surely detect the coming of Barry and plant themselves in his way. An ambush, a volley, would end this famous ride. The hills came up on them swiftly now, and if the men of Caswell failed in their duty, it meant safety for the fugitive, because 2 miles beyond were the willows of the marshes and the fords across the Asper River. There could only be 2 alternatives, since not a man showed on the hills. Either they waited in ambush, or else they had mistaken the route along which Barry would come, and the latter was hardly possible. With his glasses, Mark Retherton scanned the hills anxiously, and it was then that he saw the dark form of the wolf dog skulking on before the outlaw. He had watched Black Bart before this, of course, but never with suspicion until he noted that peculiar manner in which the animal skirted here and there through the rough ground, pausing on high places, weaving back and forth across the course of his master. Like a scout, thought Retherton, and by God, there he comes to report. For Black Bart had whirled and raced straight back for Dan. There was no need of howl or whine to give the reason of his coming. The speed of his running meant business, and Barry shortened the pace of Satan while he looked over the hills, incredulous, despairing. It could not be that men lurked there to cut him off. No living thing could have raced from Rickett to Caswell City to warn them of this coming. Nevertheless, there came Bart with the ill tidings, and it only remained to skirt swiftly east, round the dangerous ground, and strike the marshes first. He swung Satan around on this new course with a pressure of his knees and loosed him into a freer gallop. They must have sensed the meaning of this maneuver at once, for hardly had he stretched out east when voices shouted out of the hills, and around and over several low knolls came 40 horsemen racing. 6 were already due east, no escape that way, and the long line of the others came straight at him with the slope of the ground to give them velocity. Chapter 34, The Warning. All in a grim instant he saw the trap. It closed upon his consciousness with a click, and as he doubled Satan around, he knew that the only escape was in running southeast along the banks of the Asper. Even that was a desperate, a forlorn chance, for if that omnipotent voice could reach from Rickett to Caswell City, 50 miles away, certainly it must have warned the river towns of Ganton and Wilsonville and Bly Falls, where Tucker Creek ran into the Asper. But this was no time for thinking. Already looking back, he saw the posse change their saddles to 15 fresh mounts, and he headed Satan across the Wago Hills, west and south. It was hot work. Even the steel wire muscles of Black Bart were weakening under the tremendous labors of that day. And as he scouted ahead, his head was low and his red tongue lolled. The sure sign of all, the bushy tail drooped. Yet it was time to make a new call upon both wolf dog and horse, for the posse was racing after him as before, giving even the fresh, willing mounts the urge of spurs and quirts. He ran his hounds down the dripping neck and shoulder of Satan and called to him. And with a snort the stallion responded. He felt the quiver as the muscles tightened for the work. He felt the settling as Satan lengthened to racing speed. And through the Wago Hills then, with Bart picking the way as before, and never a falter in the sweep of Satan's running. If his head was a little lower, if his ears lay flat, only the master knew that meaning. And still, when he spoke, the glistening ears pricked up and they bounded on to a greater speed than before. The flight of a gull on unstirring wings when the wind buoys it, the glide of water over the descent of smooth rock, with never a ripple, like all things, effortless, swift, and free. And such was the gait of Satan as he fled. Let them spur the fresh horses from Caswell City till their flanks dripped red. They'd never gain on him. On through the hills, and now the heave of his great breaths told of the strain. Down like an arrow into the rolling ground, and now they galloped beside the Asper banks. The master looked darkly upon that water. 10 days before, when the snows had not yet reached the climax of melting, 10 days later, when that climax was overpassed, an Asper would have been fordable. But now a brown flood stormed along the gully, ate away the banks, undermined the willows here and there, and rolled stones larger than a man could lift. It went with an angry shouting as if it defied the fugitive. It was narrow, maddeningly narrow, almost small enough to attempt a leap across to the safety of the thickets on the farther side. But the force of the water alone was enough to warn the bravest swimmers away. And here and there, like teeth in the mouth of the shark, jagged stones cut the surface with white foam streaking out below them, as if to prove its power. Even while Dan turned south along the bank, a dead trunk shot down the stream and split on one of the Asper's teeth. Even then, he felt the temptation. There lay the forest on the farther side, a forest which would shelter him, and above the forest, hardly a mile back, began the grizzly peaks. They lunged straight up to snowy summits, and all along their sides, blue shadows of the afternoon drifted through a network of ravines. A promise of peace, a surety of safety, if he could reach that labyrinth. He was almost glad when he left the mockery of the river's noise to turn aside for Ganton. There it lay in a bend of the Asper in the lowlands, and every town where men lived was an enemy. He could see them now gathered just outside the village, 20 men perhaps, and 15 spare horses, the best they had for the posse. On past Ganton, and again a call upon Satan to meet the first spur of the posse on its new horses. There was something in the stallion to answer, some incredible reserve of nerve, strength, and courage. There was a slight labor now, and something of the same heave and pitch which comes in the gait of a common horse. Also, when he put Satan up the first slope beyond Ganton, he noted a faltering, a deeper lowering of the head. When his hoofs struck a loose rock, he no longer had the easy recoil of the morning. He staggered like a graceful yacht chopped by a cross-current. Now down the slope, now back to the roar of the Asper once again, for there the going was mostly level, but always the strides were shortening, and the head of the stallion nodded at his work. All that was seen by Mark Retherton through his glasses, though they were almost close enough now to see details through the naked eye. He turned in the saddle to the posse. Grim faces, sweat and dust clotted in their mustaches, their faces drawn and gray with streaks over their nose and under their eyes where perspiration ran. They rode crookedly now, for 70 miles at full speed had racked them, twisted them, cramped their muscles. Scotty kept his head tilted far back, for his spinal column seemed about to snap. Walsh leaned to his right side, which a tormenting pain drew at every stride, and Hendricks cursed and gasped through a wry mouth. It had been an hour since Mark Retherton last spoke, and when he attempted it now, his voice was as hoarse as a croaking frog. "Boys, buck up. He's done. Do you see the black a-laborin'? Do you see it? Hey, Lou, Gary, we've got the best hosses among us three. Now's the time for a spurt, and by God, we'll run him down. I'm starting." He made his word good with an Injun yell and a wave of his hat that sent his buckskin leaping straight into the air to land with stiff legs, swallowing its head. But then it straightened out in earnest. Now that buckskin had a name from Blythe Falls to Caswell City between speed and courage, and it lived up to that record in the time of need. Close behind it came Lou's and Gary's ponies, scarcely slower than the buckskin, and they closed rapidly on Satan. The plan of Retherton was plain. Now that the black was running on its nerve, a spurt might bring them within striking distance, and if they could check the flight for an instant by opening advance guard, they might drive the fugitive into a corner by the river and hold him there until the main body of the posse came up. The three of them running alone in the lead could do 5 yards for every 4 of the slow horses, and the effect showed at once. Going up a slope, the trot of the stallion maintained or even increased his lead, but when they reached the easier ground beyond, they drew rapidly upon him. They saw Barry bend low, and they saw the stallion increase its pace. "By God," shouted Retherton in involuntary admonition, "I'd rather have that hoss than the 10,000, but feed him the spurs, boys, and he'll come back to us inside of a mile." And Retherton was right. Before that mile was over, the black slipped back an inch by inch until at last Retherton called, "Now grab your guns, boys, and see if you can salt him down with lead. Give your hosses their heads and turn loose." They pulled their guns to their shoulders and sent a volley at the outlaw. One bullet clipped a spark from the rocks just behind the stallion's feet. The other 2 must have gone wide. Once more Barry flinched closer over the neck of Satan, and once again the horse answered with a fresh burst of speed. But in a few moments he came back to them. Flesh could not stand that pace after 75 miles of running. They saw that rider straighten and look back, and then the sun flashed on his rifle. "Feed him the spurs," shouted Retherton. "If we can't hit him shooting ahead, he ain't got a chance to hit us shooting backwards." For it is notoriously hard to turn in the saddle and accomplish anything with a rifle. One is moving away from the target instead of toward it, and every condition of ordinary shooting is reversed. Above all, the moment a man turns his head, he's completely out of touch with his horse. Well, apparently the fugitive knew this and made no attempt to place his shots. He merely jerked his gun to his shoulder and blazed away as soon as he was in place. Half a dozen yards in front of Retherton, the bullen kicked up the dust. "I told you," he shouted, "he can't do nothing that way. Close in, boys. Close in, for God's sake." He himself was flailing with his quirt. The buckskin grunted at every strike. Once more that rifle pitched to the outlaw's shoulder, and this time the bullet clicked on a rock not 10 feet from Retherton, and again on a straight line for him. "Damned if that ain't shooting," called Gary, and Retherton, alarmed, swung the buckskin out to one side to throw that marksman out of line. He had turned again in the saddle, and as though the episode were at an end, restored the rifle to its case. But when they poured in another volley about him, he swung sharply roundabout again, gun in hand. Once more that rifle went to his shoulder, and this time the bullet knocked a puff of dust into the very nostrils of the buckskin. Retherton reined in with an oath. "He been warning me, boys," he called. "That devil has the range like he was sitting in a rocking chair shooting at a tin can. He was warning us back to the rest of the gang, and damned if we ain't a-going." It was quite patent that was right, for 3 bullets sent on line for one horse, and each of them closer, could mean only one thing. They checked their horses, and in a moment the rest of the posse was clattering around them. "It don't make no difference," called Retherton, saving in time. "Maybe he'll last to Wilsonville, but he can't stay in 3 miles now. We hang on to him with fresh hosses. That black is running on nothing but guts right now." Chapter 35, The Asper. 90 miles of ground, at least, had been covered by that black stallion since he left Rickett that morning. Yet when he galloped across the plain in full sight of Wilsonville, there were plenty of witnesses who vowed that Satan ran like a colt frolicking over a pasture. Mark Retherton knew better, and the posse to a man felt the end was near. They changed saddles in a savage silence and went down the street out of town with a roar of racing hoofs. And Barry, too, as he watched them whip around the corner of the last house and streak across the field, knew that the end of his ride was near. Strength, wind, and nerve were gone from Satan. His hooves pounded the ground with the stamp of a plow horse. His breath came in wheezes with a rattle towards the end. The tail no longer fluttered out straight behind. Yet when that master leaned and called, he found something in his great heart with which to answer. A ghost of his old buoyancy came in his stride. The drooping head rose, one ear quivered up, and he ran against the challenge of those fresh ponies from Wilsonville. There were men who doubted it when the tale was told, but Mark Retherton swore to the truth of it. Even then, that desperate effort was failing. Not all the generous will in the heart of the stallion could give his legs the speed they needed, and he fell back by inches, by feet, by yards toward the posse. They disdained their guns now and kept them in the cases, for the game was theirs. And then they noted an odd activity in the fugitive, who had slipped to one side and was fumbling at his cinches. They could not understand for a time, but presently the saddle came loose, and the cinches flimped out, and the whole apparatus crashed to the ground. Nor was this all. The rider leaned forward, and with his hands worked on the head of his mount until the hackamore also came free and was tossed aside. To that thing 15 good men and true swore the next day with strange oaths, and told how a man rode for his life on a horse that wore neither saddle nor bridle, but ran obediently to voice and hand. Every ounce counted, and there were other ounces to be spared. He was leaning again and to his side and then to that, and presently the posse rushed past the discarded riding boots. There lay the rifle in its case and the saddle far behind, and with the rifle remained all the fugitive's chances of fighting at long range. And now following came the heavy cartridge belt and the revolver with it. The very sombrero was torn from his head and thrown away. His horse was failing visibly. Not even this lightning could keep it away from the posse long. And yet the man threw away his sole chance of safety. And the 15 pursuers cursed solemnly as they saw the truth. He would run his horse to death and then die with an empty hand, rather than let either of them fall a captive. Unburdened by saddle or gun or trappings, the stallion gave himself in the last effort. There ahead lay safety, if they could shake off the last relay of the posse, and for a time he pulled away until Retherton grew anxious, and once more the bullets were questing around the fugitive. But it was a dying effort. They gained, they drew away, and then they were only holding the posse even. And then once more they fell back gradually toward the pursuit. It was the end, and Barry sat bolt erect and looked around him. That would be the last of him, and the last scene he should see. There came the posse, distant, but running closer. With every stride, Satan staggered. With every stride, his head drooped, and all the lilt of his running was gone. 10 minutes, 5 minutes more, and the 15 would be around him. He looked to the river which thundered there at his side. It was the very swiftest portion of all the Asper between Tucker Creek and Caswell City. And even at that moment, a few hundred yards away, a tall tree which had been undermined fell into the stream and dashed the spray high. Yet even that fall was silent in the general roar of the river. Checked by the body and the branches of the tree for an instant before it should be torn away from the bank and shot downstream, the waters boiled and left a comparatively smooth, swift-sliding current beyond the obstruction, and it gave to Barry a chance, or a ghost of a chance. The central portion of the riverbed was chopped with sharp rocks which tore the stream into white rages of foam. But beyond these rocks, a little past the middle, the tree, like a dam, smoothed out the current. It was still swift, but not torn with swirls or cross-currents, and in that triangle of comparatively still water, of which the base was the fallen tree, the apex lay on a sandbar, jutting a few yards from the bank. And the forlorn hope of Barry was to swing the stallion a little distance away from the banks, run him with the last of his ebbing strength straight for the bank, and try to clear the rocky portion of the riverbed with a long leap that might, by the grace of God, shoot him into the comparatively protected current. Even then, It would be a game only a tithe won, for the chances were 10-1 that before they could struggle close to the shore, the currents would suck them out towards the center. They would never reach that shelving bit of sand, but the sharp rocks of the stream would tear them a moment later like teeth. Yet the dimmest chance was a good chance now. He called Satan away from his course, and at the change of direction the stallion staggered, but went on, turned at another call, and headed straight for the stream. He was blind with running. He was numbed by the long horror of that effort, no doubt. But there was enough strength left in him to understand that master's mind. He tossed his head high. He flaunted out his tail and sped with a ghost of his old sweeping gallop towards that bank. "Bart!" shouted the master and waved his arm. And the wolf he saw too. He seemed to cringe for a moment, and then, like some old leader of a pack who knows he is about to die and defies his death, he darted for the river and flung himself through the air. An instant later, Satan reared on the bank and shot into the air. Below him, the teeth of the rocks seemed to lift up in hunger, and the white foam jumped to take him. The crest of the arc of his jump was past. He shot lower, and grazing the last of the stones, he plunged out of sight in that swift water beyond. There were 2 falls, not one, for even while the black was in the air, Barry slipped from his back and struck the water clear of Satan. They came up again, struggling in the last effort towards the shore. The impetus of their leap had washed them well in towards the bank, but the currents dragged them out again towards the center of the stream where the rocks waited. Downriver they went, and Black Bart alone had a ghost of a chance for success. His leap had been farther, and he skimmed the surface when he struck, so that by dint of fierce swimming, he hugged close to the shore, and then his claws bedded in the sandbank. As for Barry, the waters caught him and sent him spinning over and over like a log, whipping downstream, while the heavier body of Satan was struggling whole yards above. There was no chance for the master to reach the sandbank, and even if he reached it, he could not cling, for the wolf dog knew many things about water. In the times of famine, long years before the days of his master, there had been ways of catching fish. He edged forward until the water foamed about his shoulders. Down came Dan, his arms tumbling as he whirled, and on the sleeve of one of those arms the teeth of Bart closed. The cloth was stout, and yet it ripped, as if it were rotten veiling, and the tug nearly swept Bart from his place. Still he clung. His teeth shifted their hold with the speed of light, and he closed over the arm of the master himself, slipped, sank deeper, drew blood, and held. Barry swung around and a moment later stood with his feet buried firmly in the bank. He had not a moment to spare, for Satan, only his eyes and his nose showing, rushed down the current, making his last fight. Barry thrust his feet deeper into the sand, leaned, buried both hands into the mane of the stallion. It was a far fiercer tug-of-war this time, for the ample body of the horse gave the water a greater surface to grapple on. Yet the strength of the man sufficed. His back bowed, his shoulders ached with the strain, and then the 4 feet of Satan pawed the sand, and all 3 staggered up the shelving bank, reeled among the trees, and collapsed in safety. So great was the roar of the water that they heard neither shouts nor the reports of guns. But for several minutes the bullets of the posse combed the shrubbery as high as the breast of a man. Well, they seem to get away from him from now. But you know, this thing's not over. We'll find out more next time. Until the next time I talk to you, enjoy this cooler weather and enjoy your family. This is Clay Steele. Good night.